"Listen to me, Henry," the lawyer said, his voice dropping to a harsh, impatient whisper as he tapped the thick manila folder resting on his polished mahogany desk. "This isn't a windfall. It's a massive liability. Your grandfather left you a rotting, off-grid cabin collapsing into the mud in a half-blind, arthritic dog that probably won't survive the winter. The back taxes alone will drown you before spring. I highly advise you to walk away." Henry stared at the black and white photograph of the sagging timber structure, then at the scrawled, trembling signature at the bottom of the last page. He had exactly $20 to his name. "I'll take the keys," Henry said. "I'm not leaving either of them behind." The drive into the deep, heavily forested foothills of the mountain range felt less like a journey and more like a descent into a forgotten world. Rain lashed against the cracked windshield of Henry's battered pickup truck, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the relentless downpour. The paved highway had given way to a gravel road an hour ago, and that gravel had eventually surrendered to a heavily rutted, muddy two-track trail that threatened to swallow his tires with every agonizing mile. Henry gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned bone-white. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He was 28, utterly broke, and carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of a failed contracting business that had left him with nothing but debts and a profound sense of worthlessness. When the cabin finally emerged from the dense, suffocating gloom of the towering pine trees, it looked exactly as the lawyer had promised, a monument to decay. It was a sprawling, single-story timber structure that seemed to be actively sinking into the sodden earth. The cedar shake roof was missing large patches of shingles, looking like missing teeth in a rotting jaw, and the front porch slumped heavily to the left, groaning under the weight of decades of accumulated moss and neglect. The windows, thick with grime and cobwebs, stared back at him like blank, unseeing eyes. Henry killed the engine, and the sudden silence of the woods pressed in on him, heavy and absolute, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the metal roof of his truck. He stepped out into the ankle-deep mud, the cold mountain air immediately biting through his thin denim jacket. He walked up the treacherous, rotting steps of the porch, the wood sighing ominously under his boots. He slid the heavy brass key into the rusted lock. It turned with a harsh, metallic shriek, and he pushed the heavy oak door inward. The smell hit him first, a dense, suffocating wall of damp earth, decaying wood, stale wood smoke, and the unmistakable, sharp scent of an animal. The interior was shrouded in thick, dusty shadows. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw the meager remains of his grandfather Arthur's solitary life. A battered armchair sat before a massive black cast-iron wood stove that dominated the center of the main living space. Stacks of yellowed newspapers formed chaotic towers against the walls, and a thick layer of gray dust coated every visible surface like a shroud. And then, from the shadows near the back of the room, came a low, rattling wheeze. Henry froze. Out of the darkness limped the dog. He was a large, golden retriever mix, though his coat was entirely faded to a dusty, pale gray, severely matted with burrs and dried mud. His back legs trembled with the unmistakable tremor of advanced arthritis, and his eyes were clouded with the milky blue haze of cataracts. The old dog stopped a few feet from Henry, his tail giving a single, tentative thump against the hardwood floor. He didn't bark. He merely let out a soft, heartbreakingly weary sigh, as if he had been waiting an eternity for the door to open, only to be disappointed that it wasn't the man he had spent his life guarding. "Hey there, buddy," Henry whispered, his voice catching in the dry stillness of the cabin. He slowly lowered himself to one knee, ignoring the damp chill of the floorboards seeping through his jeans. He extended an open, trembling hand. The dog hesitated, his cloudy eyes squinting, before shuffling forward. He pressed his cold, wet nose into Henry's palm, leaning his heavy, aching head against Henry's wrist. Henry looked at the faded brass tag hanging from the dog's frayed leather collar. It read Duke. For the first time in months, the tight, suffocating knot of anxiety in Henry's chest loosened just a fraction. They were both broken, both abandoned, and both at the absolute end of their respective ropes. That first night was an exercise in miserable endurance. Henry found a stack of dry firewood, stacked precariously on the back porch, and managed to coax a sputtering fire to life inside the massive cast-iron stove. The heat radiated outward, slowly pushing back the bone-chilling dampness. He shared his only dinner, a can of lukewarm chicken soup with Duke, pouring half of it over a bowl of stale kibble he found in the pantry. As the wind howled through the gaps in the cabin's chinking, sounding like restless spirits in the dark, Henry lay on a dusty mattress he had dragged onto the floor near the stove. Duke curled up tightly against his back, the dog's steady, raspy breathing becoming the only anchor Henry had in the overwhelming darkness. He stared up at the water-stained ceiling, thinking about his grandfather. Arthur had been a ghost to him, a man who had walked out on Henry's father decades ago, vanishing into the wilderness, and leaving behind a legacy of bitter resentment. Henry had inherited that anger, but lying here in the ruins of the old man's life, all he felt was a profound, hollow sadness. He closed his eyes, pulling the threadbare blanket tighter, unaware that the ground beneath him held a secret that would shatter everything he thought he knew. 3 weeks bled into one another, marked by splintered fingernails, aching muscles that spasmed in the freezing nights, and the relentless, creeping dread of the approaching winter. Henry threw himself into repairing the cabin with a manic, almost punishing desperation. It was no longer just about making the property presentable enough to sell and pay off the back taxes. It was about sheer, primal survival. Every morning, he woke before dawn, his breath hanging in the frigid air like pale smoke, to coax the embers of the cast-iron stove back to life. He patched the glaring, jagged holes in the rotting cedar roof using scavenged sheets of rusted corrugated tin he found half buried in the woods, his hands numb and bleeding as he hammered salvaged nails. He chopped cords of damp, stubborn hickory and oak, until his shoulders screamed in agony, and his palms were covered in thick, weeping blisters that eventually hardened into tough calluses. He sealed the drafty, rattling windows with whatever scraps of heavy-duty plastic sheeting and silver duct tape he could strip from his truck's toolbox, transforming the cabin into a patchwork fortress against the wind. His meager food supply dwindled rapidly to nothing but dry white rice and cheap pinto beans boiled in a dented aluminum pot. Yet, despite his own gnawing hunger, he always ensured Duke had the lion's share of whatever protein he could scrounge, sharing the last tin of sardines, carefully picking the bones out by the light of a flickering kerosene lantern. In those quiet, desperate evenings, as the wind howled outside, Henry would sit on the dusty floor beside the old dog, gently massaging Duke's swollen, arthritic joints. The shared misery stripped away Henry's lingering anger, replacing it with a quiet, profound kinship. They were two discards of the world, keeping each other alive through sheer stubbornness. As the days shortened and the temperature plummeted, Duke's behavior began to change in ways that deeply unsettled Henry. Initially, the old dog had spent his days sleeping in a patch of pale sunlight near the front door, or limping slowly behind Henry as he worked. But lately, an obsessive, almost frantic compulsion had taken hold of the animal. It started with a soft, persistent scratching. Henry would be working outside, swinging an axe into a log, and he would hear the rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch echoing from inside the cabin. He would walk in to find Duke lying near the massive, Victorian-era cast-iron wood stove that anchored the center of the room. The dog wasn't just lying there. He was aggressively pawing at a specific, seemingly unremarkable section of the wide plank oak floorboards, directly beneath the heavy iron lip of the stove's base. "Duke, leave it," Henry would say, exhausted, wiping soot and sweat from his forehead. "There's nothing there, just mice." But Duke wouldn't stop. He would pause, look up at Henry with his milky, unreadable eyes, and let out a low, desperate whine before digging his worn, cracked nails back into the hardwood. As the days passed, the scratching escalated into a frantic, obsessive digging. Duke began refusing to eat unless Henry moved his food bowl to that exact spot. He would sleep with his massive head pressed flat against the floorboards, his ears perked as if listening to something buried deep within the earth. Henry tried pulling the dog away, dragging a soft rug to the opposite corner of the room to create a more comfortable bed, but Duke fought him, planting his arthritic legs and growling a deep, rumbling sound that wasn't aggressive but violently protective. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in late November. A freak, violent thunderstorm rolled over the mountain ridge, bringing with it torrential rain and deafening claps of thunder that shook the cabin to its very foundations. Lightning flashed in strobing, ghostly bursts through the dusty windows, casting long, monstrous shadows across the walls. The thunder terrified Duke, but instead of hiding under the bed, it sent him into a frenzy. In the flashing light, Henry watched in disbelief as the old dog began tearing at the floorboards with a manic, youthful strength he didn't know the animal possessed. Duke's paws were bleeding, leaving dark smears on the wood, his jaws snapping at the edges of the oak planks, splintering the aged wood. "Duke, stop! You're hurting yourself," Henry yelled over the roar of the storm, dropping to his knees and trying to wrap his arms around the dog's thick torso. Duke ripped himself out of Henry's grasp, whirled around, and barked. It wasn't the weak, raspy cough of a dying dog. It was a sharp, commanding, deafening roar that echoed off the cabin walls, cutting straight through the thunder. Duke stared dead into Henry's eyes, then slammed his heavy paw down on the floorboard beneath the stove. Thump. He looked at Henry again. Thump. Henry sat back on his heels, his chest heaving, the realization slowly washing over him. The dog wasn't chasing mice. He wasn't losing his mind. He was trying to show him something. Henry stood up and walked over to his canvas tool bag. He pulled out a heavy steel crowbar and a heavy-duty flashlight. He returned to the stove. The cast-iron behemoth must have weighed 500 pounds. It was bolted to a thick slate pad, which was, in turn, secured to the floor. Henry examined the wood Duke had been tearing at. He noticed, for the first time, that the planks in this specific 3-foot square weren't fastened with the modern, round wire nails used in the rest of the room. They were pinned down with old, square-headed, hand-forged iron pegs. Adrenaline began to pump through Henry's exhausted veins, temporarily erasing the cold and the pain in his back. He wedged the flat edge of the crowbar under the thick slate pad of the stove. He strained, using every ounce of leverage his body could muster, letting out a raw, guttural yell as he threw his weight onto the bar. With a sickening scrape of metal on stone, the massive stove shifted just a few inches to the right, just enough to clear the anomalous floorboards. Panting heavily, sweat dripping from his nose despite the freezing air, Henry wedged the crowbar into the seam between the oak planks. The old wood groaned in protest, fighting him, but he leaned into it with desperate strength. With a loud, sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot, the rusted iron pegs gave way. Henry dropped the crowbar, dug his bleeding fingers under the edge of the heavy plank, and ripped it up, throwing it aside. He tore up the second board, then the third, exposing the dark, dusty space between the heavy floor joists. Duke immediately stopped whining. He limped forward, sniffed the dark hole, and sat down quietly, looking up at Henry with an expression of profound, finished duty. Henry clicked on the flashlight and shone the beam into the crawl space. Resting on the dry, packed earth between the thick wooden joists was an object tightly wrapped in heavy, waterproof oilcloth, bound tightly with thick, waxed cord. It was the size of a large suitcase and covered in decades of undisturbed dust. With trembling hands, Henry reached down into the dark. The bundle was shockingly heavy, dragging Henry's arms down as he hauled it up from the darkness and dropped it onto the living room floor. It hit the wood with a dense, solid thud that kicked up a cloud of gray dust, making Henry cough. Duke remained sitting perfectly still, his milky eyes locked on the object, his tail giving one slow, rhythmic sweep across the floor. Henry knelt beside it, pulling a rusted folding knife from his pocket. His hands were shaking violently, not from the freezing temperature of the cabin, but from an overwhelming surge of pure, electric anticipation. He sliced through the thick, waxed cord, pulling away the layers of stiff, foul-smelling oilcloth. Beneath the protective wrapping lay a massive, military-grade steel lockbox, painted a drab olive green. The metal was pitted with surface rust, but it was incredibly solid. A heavy brass padlock secured the heavy hasp. Henry didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy steel crowbar, wedged the hooked end through the loop of the padlock, and brought his work boot down violently onto the bar. The rusted internal pins of the lock shattered with a sharp snap, and the brass body fell away to the floor. Henry took a deep breath, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He gripped the heavy steel latch and threw the lid back. The smell of old, dry paper, metallic copper, and aged leather wafted up from the box. Inside, the space was meticulously organized. Resting on top were 3 thick, leather-bound ledgers, their pages yellowed with age. Beneath the ledgers sat a series of small, heavy canvas bags tied tightly with leather drawstrings, and packed tightly around the bags were dozens of thick, heavy-stock manila envelopes, wrapped tightly in rubber bands that had long since dried out and crumbled into dust. Henry reached for one of the canvas bags first. It was surprisingly heavy, about the size of a grapefruit but weighing nearly 10 pounds. He untied the stiff leather cord and tipped the bag into his open palm. A cascade of heavy, perfectly circular metal discs spilled out, catching the pale, flashing light of the storm outside. Henry gasped, dropping the bag in shock. They were gold coins, but they weren't just any gold. Even with his limited knowledge, he recognized the iconic, striding figure of Liberty. They were Street Gauden's double eagles, pristine and uncirculated, and there were hundreds of them, split across several canvas bags. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. He pushed the bags aside and carefully opened one of the thick manila envelopes. Inside was a stack of intricately printed, oversized certificates. The elaborate scrollwork and official government seals were unmistakable. They were bearer bonds, series after series, issued in the late 1970s and early 1980s, each bearing denominations that made Henry's vision blur. $50,000, $100,000, tightly stacked, perfectly preserved, legally payable to whoever held them in their physical possession. "What did you do, Grandpa?" Henry whispered into the darkness, his voice cracking, entirely unable to process the sheer, impossible volume of wealth staring back at him from the rusted box. He reached for the topmost leather ledger, his fingers tracing the embossed, worn cover. He opened it. The pages weren't filled with accounting figures, but with tight, immaculate, cramped handwriting. It was a journal. Henry turned to the very last page, where a fresh sheet of paper had been folded and tucked into the binding. It was addressed simply, "To the one who stayed." Henry angled the flashlight, his eyes scanning the ink that seemed to pulse with the voice of a ghost. "If you are reading this, Henry, it means you did not turn your back on the only friend I had left in this world. It means you stayed when the world told you to run. I have spent my entire life running. I made a fortune in the early days of silicon and aerospace, long before you were born. But wealth is a poison to a broken mind. I watched money tear my brothers apart, turning them into vicious, paranoid strangers, terrified of what it would do to my own family, terrified of my own unworthiness as a father. I hid it. I ran into the woods, thinking I could protect your father by staying away. It was the greatest, most cowardly mistake of my life." A hot tear broke free and rolled down Henry's dirt-streaked cheek. He wiped it away with a trembling hand and continued reading. "I died knowing your father hated me, and knowing he passed that justifiable hatred onto you. I could not face you in life to hand you this burden. So, I entrusted my redemption to Duke. I trained him to guard this spot, hoping, praying that whoever inherited this rotting tomb would have the decency, the sheer human kindness, to care for a broken, worthless dog. If you had abandoned him, the secret would have stayed buried in the dirt forever, returning to the earth where it belongs. But you didn't. You possess the heart your father and I so tragically lacked. The wealth in this box is yours. Forgive me, Henry. Use it to build, not to hide." Henry stared at the last line until the words blurred into a solid, meaningless black line. The gravity of the revelation crushed the breath out of his lungs. His grandfather hadn't been a crazy, destitute hermit. He had been a profoundly terrified, deeply broken man trying desperately to orchestrate a posthumous salvation. The fortune wasn't just money. It was a grueling, brilliant test of character. Henry dropped the letter, the paper fluttering softly to the floor. He fell forward onto his hands and knees, the cold gold coins scattering beneath his palms, and he finally broke. He wept. He wept for his grandfather's lonely, wasted life, for his father's bitter, angry end, and for his own years of suffocating struggle. Duke let out a soft whine, shuffling forward to press his warm, heavy body against Henry's side. Henry threw his arms around the old dog's thick neck, burying his face in the dusty gray fur, sobbing into the quiet darkness of the cabin while the storm raged outside, washing the mountain clean. The transition back to the world of the living was dizzying, a surreal blur of sterile offices, security vaults, and stunned professionals. A week after unearthing the lockbox, Henry sat in the plush, leather-bound office of a premier numismatic appraiser in the city, wearing his only clean flannel shirt. He had brought just 3 of the gold coins. The appraiser, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, had stared at the Street Gauden's double eagles through a jeweler's loop in absolute, breathless silence for 5 minutes before looking up, his hands visibly shaking. "These are flawless," the appraiser had whispered, his voice hushed with reverence. Pre-1933. Uncirculated condition. Where on earth did you find these? They are worth upwards of $80,000 each. The bearer bonds, validated by a bewildered team of high-powered attorneys Henry hired shortly after, pushed the total valuation of the rusted steel lockbox to a staggering $7.4 million. In the span of a single month, Henry had gone from contemplating bankruptcy to holding a generational fortune. The sheer scale of the money could have allowed him to walk away from the mountains forever, to buy a penthouse in the city, to vanish into a life of effortless luxury, and never look back at the rotting timber structure that had nearly frozen him to death. But Henry didn't run. The money had changed his bank account, but the cabin, his grandfather's letter, and the faithful old dog had fundamentally changed his soul. He didn't sell the land. Instead, he poured his newfound resources and his own dormant carpentry skills into the property. He hired a crew of the best local craftsmen, men he had once idolized, and together they meticulously brought Arthur's cabin back from the brink of collapse. They didn't demolish it. They restored it. They reinforced the sagging foundation, replaced the rotting cedar shakes with thick, weather-treated timber, installed soaring, energy-efficient glass windows that flooded the gloomy interior with golden mountain light, and laid down radiant heated hardwood floors. The cabin transformed from a tomb of regret into a breathtaking, warm sanctuary in the heart of the woods. But Henry's most extravagant expenditures were reserved entirely for Duke. The old dog, whose loyalty had unlocked a literal empire, was treated like a reigning monarch. Henry hired a private veterinary specialist to visit the cabin weekly. Duke underwent cutting-edge laser therapy for his arthritis, began a regimen of premium joint supplements and pain management medications, and dined on custom-made meals of seared salmon and organic vegetables. When Duke's back legs finally grew too weak to support him, Henry bought him a custom-fitted, all-terrain dog wheelchair, allowing the old boy to continue rolling proudly through the forest trails, his nose raised high to catch the scent of the pine trees. For 8 beautiful, comfortable months, Duke lived a life of absolute, unburdened peace. He spent his evenings sleeping on an expansive, heated orthopedic bed positioned perfectly in front of the massive, meticulously restored cast-iron wood stove. Henry would sit beside him, reading his grandfather's old ledgers, the bitter legacy of his family completely rewritten by the warmth of the fire and the gentle, rhythmic thumping of Duke's tail. When the end finally came, it was quiet, gentle, and utterly devoid of fear. It was a crisp, clear morning in early autumn, the leaves turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Duke simply didn't wake up from his spot by the stove. He passed away in his sleep, surrounded by warmth, profoundly loved, and knowing his long watch was finally over, Henry buried him under the sprawling canopy of the oldest, grandest oak tree on the property, marking the grave with a smooth, heavy river stone. He stood over the fresh earth, the crisp mountain wind rustling the leaves, and felt a deep, resonant peace settle over him. The millions sitting in his trust fund had given him freedom, but it was the broken, unwanted dog that had given him a purpose. Later that year, Henry launched a philanthropic foundation dedicated to building high-quality, sustainable homes for struggling, low-income families, using his grandfather's hoarded wealth to finally build the communities Arthur had been too terrified to join. He had taken the heavy, rusted chains of his family's past and forged them into something enduring and beautiful, proving that the greatest treasures are never simply found, they are earned through the quiet, steadfast courage of a kind heart. True wealth is rarely found in the places we expect. Often, it lies hidden deep beneath the heavy burdens we are advised to leave behind. Henry's choice to embrace a forgotten, collapsing cabin and a broken elderly dog brought him millions, but the greatest inheritance was the profound restoration of his own heart and his family's fractured legacy. Compassion, ultimately, is the master key that unlocks our greatest rewards. If you were moved by Henry and the faithful dog's incredible journey from abandonment to redemption, please give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a great story, and subscribe to our channel for more cinematic tales of life's hidden miracles.